千里之行，始于足下. A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. As ever, I would like to extend a warm welcome to one and all. Thank you for joining us. I want to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment in time, to the here and now, to be fully present and mindfully aware as we all ready ourselves for this sacred process in the Tao with one another. I think everyone remembers from our discussion previously that the chapter title, there are two titles for this particular chapter. There's the Master Executioner, and then there's the Great Carpenter. So as we discussed previously, the Master Executioner is a metaphor similar to the heavenly net of the previous chapter. It refers to the Tao. It refers to the laws of consequence, cause and effect. So when people are acting contrary to the Tao, if they are reckless, they may be charging to their deaths. And it is as if there's a master executioner that is overseeing their execution. That is the metaphor. Then the great carpenter is the other metaphor. This is the one that can be seen as just a way to explain the master executioner. So what the chapter says is that we should not kill in place of the master executioner, just like we would not substitute for the great carpenter who's very skillful in cutting wood. Now, it can be seen as a metaphor itself. Just like the heavenly nets, just like the master executioner, and we will explore that difference in our completion of chapter 74 today. So let's go ahead and take another look at the sectional breakdown of chapter 74. And this is the analysis that we did previously. This chapter is essentially divided into three sections, two halves, and the first half is divided into two subsections. So the first section one, or subsection one, starts out with a question that is asked by Lao Tzu. And the question is, deterrence, punishing people by death, does that really work as a deterrent? Then in the same section, the first half, it goes into the thinking of the tyrant, or the conventional thinking that was commonplace and widespread at the time of Lao Tzu. And that thinking is something that we can recognize too. It's based on human nature and fear. So the tyrant's position is that, well, I'll make people afraid of death, so that those who act out, I capture and kill them. That way, they won't dare. Now, the reason why Lao Tzu asked the question at the outset is to be able to frame a rebuttal to this common conventional mindset about using fear. And his rebuttal in the second line is that, well, you can't threaten them with death if they're not afraid of death. Then the bottom half, the second half, is the metaphor to explain that position. So the master executioner, as we talked about, is the part of the Tao that kills. It's not just life that is the Tao. Death is very much part of the Tao as well. Then it goes into the great carpenter metaphor to explain the master executioner metaphor. And then the conclusion is that let's not, our Western modern expression is play God. Let's not make decisions of life and death lightly. Let's leave it to the laws of karma, the laws of consequences. So people will meet their end when they're supposed to. We don't need to go out of our way to accelerate that. That's basically what the chapter is all about. So previously, we talked about the difference between how the tyrant thought and what Lao Tzu said. The tyrant, as you can see at the top line there, is using fear and death and also punishment to keep the people in line. And the rebuttal from Lao Tzu is, well, that doesn't work. People are going to rise up against you when you push them beyond their limits. They don't have a fear of death anymore, and suddenly you've lost your power over them. So fearing death is the overarching narrative here. Whether or not it works, it really depends. So this leads to the discussion of the Tao of cause and effect. So there are several different ways to express that. There are two ways in this chapter. There's one particular way in the previous chapter that was the heavenly net. So karma, in the view of Lao Tzu, before he even heard of the term karma, the Tao is like a heavenly net. It catches everything. So negative consequences that you create will be responded in kind with negative consequences for you. Just like every fish will be caught in the net, nothing will get past the net. Then, in this chapter, there is the master executioner. So we understand that death has always been part of the Tao. If you are unwise, if you are reckless, you will come to an early end, much like prisoners being executed, except that we do understand it is because of personal, individual decisions that lead to the demise, that lead to the foolish or reckless or unwise being killed when they could easily avoid that fate. Then, the other metaphor, the great carpenter. This is the skillful carpenter that can cut the wood down to a precise length that is necessary for construction. So those that move against the Tao are pieces of wood that are too long and will be cut down to size. Finally, we talked about karma. This is what we know nowadays. This is from Hinduism and then from Buddhism, or just popular culture, because popular culture today is saturated with references of karma. That's why the source is various. And we all know what that means. What goes around comes around. Whatever consequences you create and generate, they come back to you. So the energies you project into the world, whether it's positive or negative, it'll circle back. You may not see it for a while, but it will come around, and it will be amplified many times. So we talked about this last time as well. And then we got into the ending discussion, which is rather elaborate. So we were not able to complete all of it, but that's okay. It gives us plenty of time today to talk about this in detail. This slide we looked at previously, and this is about the last line. The last line says, it is rare that they do not hurt their own hands. That's what happens when the inexperienced apprentice tries to use the sharp tools of the master craftsman, that is the great carpenter. So not knowing how to use those tools appropriately, properly, the inexperienced apprentice may hurt himself. And that's due to the lack of skills. So this is to say that we are the ones who are the amateurs. We are not the great carpenter. When we talk about the master craftsman, that is the great carpenter, Using the tool to cut, we extend that to all the different cases that we talked about last time. The tyrant will be overthrown. The vigilante that thought about taking justice into his own hands will be caught, will be arrested, and treated like the criminal, because the vigilante, in essence, is operating outside the law and therefore a criminal in the eyes of the law. And even when we, as a society, practice capital punishment, it is rare that we do not cause some kind of damage to ourselves. So I want to be specific about that. I wanted to talk about what that means when I say damage from capital punishment. So the considerations that we went through in the last slide that we went over last time are exactly as you see here. When we kill a murderer that is condemned for killing, we are doing the same act, the killing, that the murderer is convicted of. So I am not equating the two, only to point out that there are similarities between that act of killing and the act of killing in return. There are similarities, they're not exactly the same. I understand and recognize that. And once upon a time, I was very much a proponent of that, but I've had to rethink my position upon studying the Tao. Number two is that because we're human beings, we're not perfect. Our system is not perfect, so there's always going to be some wrongful executions. And that's true in our society. And if you were to look at the studies of that, there's definitely been wrongful executions. And this is especially dramatic with the rise of DNA evidence that cast previous convictions into doubt. And then, because of the finality of death in execution, there's no further possibility of remorse or making amends. And this is also put against the realistic expectation that there are psychopathic, sociopathic killers who will never, ever be remorseful, never, ever make amends. Definitely recognize and understand that. Now, that doesn't mean that there will never be a few among the convicted on death row that will experience true remorse or have the possibility of making amends. All we're saying here is that the finality of death will completely cut that off, so it is no longer a possibility. It goes from perhaps 1% to 0%. And then lastly, and this is the point made by Lao Tzu at the very beginning, that if you want to deter criminal acts with capital punishment, well, it doesn't really have a deterrence effect. And study after study has proven that Lao Tzu is essentially correct in this assertion as well. And last time we talked about the reasons why. So we've seen the perspective of the Tao from what Lao Tzu expresses in this chapter. And what I didn't get to do was to also talk about the Zen tradition, the Zen Buddhism perspective on the same thing. So for that, I would actually like to share yet another story with you from Huinan. And this is the Zen perspective on criminals and Buddha nature. Buddha nature is the potential in all sentient beings to become the Buddha. So remember from our previous discussions, it isn't something that is likely to be accomplished within a single lifetime. You and I, as immortal spirits, go through lifetime after lifetime, learning, mastering, incorporating, integrating, lesson after lesson, until we're in a position, perhaps many lifetimes from now, to actually experience the awakening of enlightenment, to attain Buddhahood. It isn't cut and dry. Even as we are today, all of us will experience moments of Buddhahood, moments of enlightenment every once in a while. It's just that you and I are not wise enough or cultivated, refined enough to experience those Buddha moments consistently. Greater consistency is the goal of Tao cultivation. So that is Buddha nature. We all have it. Everyone has it. And this leads to a question that was asked to the sixth patriarch, Huineng, of the Zen tradition. It was at the time when he was finally recognized as the sixth patriarch, having inherited the mantle from his predecessor, the fifth patriarch. Upon that recognition, he was asked the question, has the fifth patriarch given you additional instructions? Huineng said, no, there were no additional instructions. We have to see our original nature. Our original nature is what awakens to Buddhahood. And Huineng specifically said the fifth patriarch did not talk about liberation, spiritual or otherwise, through meditative practices, because that would add yet another thing to Buddha's Dharma. Dharma is teaching. And the Dharma from the Buddha is the one and only path. Now, this puzzled people that he was explaining it to, so he was asked, what do you mean Buddha's Dharma is the only path? And Huineng said that, well, it's exactly as explained in the Nirvana Sutra. Once upon a time, the Buddha was asked the question about most heinous criminals, criminals who committed every act of crime imaginable. We're talking killing, stealing, everything, anything, the most horrible crimes that you can imagine, these evil individuals had committed them. So they are so evil, would such people not be forever cut off from Buddhahood? I mean, look at them. And in our world, we see the absolute, we see examples of absolute evil, exactly like what they were talking about. And we can, maybe conclude already that, oh, those people, they have no hope of ever awakening their Buddha nature whatsoever. No hope, zero possibility. So this was the question that was asked. And the Buddha, upon being asked this question, replied that the potential in all sentient beings to become enlightened, that was a pure essence beyond all good and evil, beyond all virtuous deeds and criminal actions. So ordinary people like ourselves, we would see the difference between the good people and the bad people. Goodness and evil, we see the difference. But the truly wise ones, said the Buddha, saw only the unified essence that could not be cut off or separated from anything else. This is the oneness of Buddha nature. So now you see the perspective from the Zen. They recognize that society has to protect itself from the bad people. Society has that obligation. You have to make sure criminals cannot cause further harm. It doesn't mean that you let them walk free, but at the same time, there's also no need to be hateful of the evil ones, of the criminals. And from the Zen or Buddhist perspective, it is not within our rights or obligations to take over for nature and cut short their lives. We need to keep them away, but not necessarily exact vengeance against them. And I hope this distinction is clear for everyone. I do know, I do understand that it can be rather tricky when you think about some of the most horrible examples. And what about this? What about that? So, for that reason, I would like to share a story with you to further explore this topic, the topic of the Buddha and karma, in order to illustrate this point. So, this is a story that I call Be the Buddha. Once upon a time in ancient China, there was this temple that had a large statue of the Buddha in its main hall. This temple was not the same as every other temple. You see, because over the years, it became known for miracles. People talked about this. People said that, listen, the Buddha will grant your wish if you come to this temple to pray. And of course, everybody is like, really? Is that true? This made it so popular that the monks at the temple, they had to hire a guard to watch over everything, to look over all the visitors coming and going, provide assistance to them. So this guard at the temple, he saw the stream of all these people coming and going. And he thought about that it must be extremely difficult to handle so many prayers. He could not imagine how the Buddha could hear all these prayers and be able to grant the wishes in order for the miracles to occur. He thought this must be a really difficult thing to do. So one day he knelt before the Buddha in order to say a prayer of his own. Here's what he said. He said, "Great Buddha, I have only one wish, and I wish to know what it is like to be you. Is it not a heavy burden to listen to all the people who come here? I wish to help you with this great responsibility. Can you make me more like you so I can share the burden?" The man was not expecting to hear an answer, but much to his surprise, the Buddha responded. In his mind, the Buddha replied, "Yes, I can grant you this wish, but you must agree to one condition. You may listen to all the prayers directed to me, but only if you say and do nothing, no matter what you see or hear." The man heard this and thought, well, this will be easy. Yeah, I can listen, but I don't need to say anything. I don't need to do anything. So he readily agreed. The Buddha then said, there is a small place behind the statue, a space where you can hide. If you hide there behind the statue, I will let you hear the prayers. You will also be able to see everything from the vantage point of that place without being seen yourself. So the guard didn't know about this. He went and looked behind the statue and found it was true. There was a place behind the statue where he could hide. So he hid there to listen and observe quietly, exactly as instructed by the Buddha. So many people came and went. The man indeed heard the prayers. Whether it was said out loud or silent, he heard them, just as the Buddha said he would. He found that many of the requests were quite reasonable, but some were definitely not reasonable, and some were outrageous. Regardless of how reasonable he thought it was, through it all, the guard kept quiet. He honored the Buddha's condition. A few days later, there was a wealthy merchant who came to the temple. He set his back aside and he prayed for material success. And after he was done, he left still thinking materialistic thoughts and forgetting all about the bag that he left behind. The guard saw it all from the hiding place. He wanted to call out to the merchant, like, hey, you forgot your bag, come back. But he stopped himself from saying anything because he remembered his agreement with the Buddha. Shortly thereafter, another person came in the temple. A poor man came into the great hall before the Buddha. He had failed badly in business. He suffered a huge setback. So in his prayer, he asked the Buddha to help him and his family through this hard time. As he was leaving, he caught sight of the bag that was left behind. He opened it and he found it contained a lot of money. He looked around, but he was alone in the main hall. Well, clearly, this money was meant for him, he thought. It must be the Buddha answering his prayers. It was true. Miracles occurred in this temple. He thanked the Buddha and then he left to go home. Again, the guard saw it all from his hiding place. He wanted to call out to this man to tell him that, stop, listen, this bag doesn't belong to you, it belongs to someone else. But he stopped himself from saying anything because he remembered his agreement with the Buddha. Shortly thereafter, a young man came before the Buddha. He was about to go on a long trip, so he prayed to the Buddha for the blessing of a safe journey. Then he got ready to leave. As he was about to leave, the merchant came running back in, looking frantically for his bag. The merchant saw that the bag was no longer where he left it. Then he saw the young man about to leave. He put two and two together. It seemed pretty obvious. The young man took the bag. So he grabbed the young man and accused him of stealing. The young man pushed back. Had no idea what he was talking about. A physical altercation ensued. And the situation quickly got out of hand as they were shoving back and forth. The guard could not tolerate this disruption of the harmony in that sacred temple. So from behind the statue, he said, stop. The two men froze up, startled by what they thought had to be the Buddha's voice. They turned to look at the statue. The guard continued speaking as if he was the Buddha and told the merchant the young man had nothing to do with his bag. The bag, he explained, was taken by the man who left right before the young man came in. So both the merchant and the young man thanked the Buddha. The merchant left in a big hurry because he wanted to go after the poor man who had his bag. The young man also left in a hurry because he had to catch the ferry that would take him on the first leg of his journey because he was going on a long journey. So the guard was feeling pretty satisfied with himself. He felt that, well, I have done a good deed. Then the Buddha appeared. The Buddha said, you can come out of the hiding place now. You have broken the agreement, so you are no longer qualified to hear prayers. The guard came out, but he felt like he had to explain himself. Great Buddha, surely you can see that I had no choice but to speak up. He said, it was a misunderstanding after all, and the young man, you see, was unjustly accused by the merchant. I spoke the truth, only to clarify the situation. Why would that be wrong? I didn't do anything wrong. The Buddha said, you do not understand the intricate connections of karma. The merchant already had more wealth than he could use. And he was intending to spend the money in the bag in gambling. The poor man had lost everything, and he desperately needed the money to feed his starving children. It dawned on the guard that perhaps he made a mistake. He thought about it, and then he asked, well, what about the young man? At least I cleared the false accusation against him. The Buddha said, his is perhaps the most tragic fate. If you did not speak up, his argument with the merchant would delay him sufficiently so he would miss his boat, and that would actually save his life. Now he's on board a ship that is sinking into the ocean. His fellow passengers will be saved. They will be all right, but he does not know how to swim. He will drown, and that will end a life full of unrealized potential. The end. So that is a story of Be the Buddha, and let's talk about the story. So I want to share with everyone that when Tao masters tell stories, they do not just tell the story and then let people figure it out. So traditionally, in the great oral traditions, in the Tao, they explain the multiple layers of meaning in the story, because without a Tao-centric explanation, it is possible that the listeners will misunderstand what the message is trying to convey. So the question for everyone to ponder, and what the message that some people can take out of it is this. The question is the story telling us we should always say and do nothing? Because after all, we don't know all the karmic connections. So the answer to that question, as the Tao Master would explain after the story, is no. The key to this story is that we should not act out of ignorance or surface appearance or partial knowledge. Because think about this, there is a Tao teaching about non-interference. Does it mean that we, as Tao cultivators, would never interfere with anything, even when it is clear that we should? And the answer is no. A Tao cultivator will learn first and foremost to refrain from dealing in absolutes, like never, always, etc. Life is shades of gray, and the skill in the Tao is to recognize when something should be done or when we should simply observe. So this story is a warning about the human tendency to interfere excessively, particularly before we really understand the full situation. So this is actually a way to illustrate the principle of non-interference. So the guard was able to hear the prayers, but could not see the myriad causes and effects. This is similar to a real world situation for you and me, for everybody. We often cannot perceive karmic connections with clarity. We too, like the guard, we cannot see all the causes and effects. Sometimes we can, often we cannot. So we're no different from the guard in that respect. Now, karma itself is like the heavenly net. Nothing gets through. In the long run, everything balances out. A lot of times we cannot see that, and therefore we don't feel like we can just stand by and let it happen. And we tend to go in the opposite direction too much, so we interfere rashly before we fully understand what is happening. So how about the Buddha? In the story, the Buddha is like the great carpenter. The Buddha has the understanding of the intricate causes and effects. That means the great carpenter is able to cut wood with precision to the exact length required. And the metaphor is very useful in this case because there is a length that should not be too long or too short. If you are unskillful, if you are not the great carpenter, you can cut not enough or you can cut too much, which will render that piece of wood useless. This is in addition to the possibility of cutting yourself, injuring your own hand. So we are not the great carpenter. We should not act on behalf of the Tao. Sometimes we have this very strong tendency that like we should do something, and then we realize later on that, well, we didn't really know what we were doing. So this, what we need is much more of a balanced approach or the path of moderation. And let me explain what the sages would actually do. The sages understand the teaching from this particular chapter, that those who substitute for the great carpenter to cut, it is rare that they do not hurt their own hands. This does not prevent the sages themselves from taking action. They still do take action. However, they observe. They will take a moment to understand the situation. Then, after a while, because of the skills that they have accumulated, they understand what it takes, what is really required. Maybe what is required is to continue observing. That's the non-action part of Wu Wei. Then, occasionally, they need to take an action that is minimal, that is a nudge, that is just maybe a smile, maybe just a tap, that has the most impact on the situation to cause it to resolve in a positive way. Minimal actions. This idea is pervasive throughout the Tao mindset within ancient Chinese culture. If you think about the concept when it applies physically to real life situations, think about, for instance, pressure points. There are pressure points that you can apply some pressure on that with just the right amount of force, it'll relieve a lot of pain. Same kind of idea. Sometimes just a little bit of action can make a huge amount of difference, but not before we fully understand what is going on. And in most cases, we want to watch our tendency to interfere, which is the whole point of this story. To be the Buddha, you must think like the Buddha. Let's continue on. So we're about to wrap up this chapter with a final point about applying what we have just learned into our lives. As we go through our lives, we're definitely going to encounter those who inflict damage. People who have done bad things, and sometimes those bad things have been done against us. Have you had that experience? I definitely have. There are good and bad people in life, that's a given. And sometimes we contemplate vengeance, revenge, meting out justice personally. Let's be honest, have we all had those thoughts? Let's admit it, we've all had those thoughts. With the metaphors of this chapter, Lao Tzu is saying no to vengeance. So if capital punishment is done in vengeance, in revenge for an evil act, a criminal act, Lao Tzu would speak against that. And applying that to your life and my life, Lao Tzu would also say, watch for the tendency to try to get back at someone, to exact your own personal vengeance. And a lot of times, Lao Tzu would even say that if you think about you taking actions, it could be excessive interference against the working of karma. So the great carpenter or the master executioner will be the one to do the cutting, which means that the laws of karma will apply. And if you try to do that yourself, it's definitely an interference. Taking matters into your own hands is a way to interfere with the natural workings of Tao principle. So we should not interfere with the process. We should not try to do it ourselves. This goes back to a wisdom that I think we have all heard in the Western world. This is the wisdom that is congruent with the Tao, because in the Tao, revenge is contrary to the Tao. Revenge is opposite to the Tao, opposed to the Tao. The saying that we all know in the West is living well is the best revenge. And I hope everyone has heard that saying, living well is the best revenge. What that means to us is that we have to let go of the past, let the cosmic scales balance it out. There is another saying that sometimes has been attributed to Lao Tzu or to Confucius. It's actually a Western invention. Let me share that with you. Some have quoted Confucius, not realize it's a misquote, that those who embark on a journey of vengeance should dig 2 graves, one for your enemy, one for yourself. Why is that? Well, if you look at that saying, it is basically telling you that a journey of vengeance, you embark on a journey of vengeance, you may succeed in killing the target of your hatred, but you should also be prepared to perish yourself. In other words, vengeance is a no-win scenario. Or pull it back to this chapter we're studying. Why should you dig 2 graves when you embark on a journey of vengeance? Because it is like cutting wood, trying to be the master, the carpenter, the great carpenter. You're going to end up cutting your own hand with a sharp tool. You're going to damage yourself, even as you cause damage to the subject of your hatred. So rather than to do that, what we should do instead is to turn our focus on living well. To live well in the Tao context is simply to live our best lives in accordance with the Tao. There's no need to worry about someone else getting away with some sort of injustice they committed against you in the past. Why? Because a heavenly net will not anything get through. The master executioner, the great carpenter, they take care of business in the long run. And that means all of us, if there's any shred of vengeance in our hearts, we should just let go of that. And this is the conclusion of our discussion on chapter 74. We're now in the paraphrase section of our talk on Tao Te Ching chapter 74. So we will go into the 2 halves, the top half and the bottom half, and we'll do those separately. So the first half, as you have seen, is basically, you can think of it as a conversation between Lao Tzu and a tyrant. So what Lao Tzu is asking is about the deterrence effect, and what the tyrant expresses is the perspective of tyranny. So here's the paraphrase that I would like to offer for that. Rulers who do not understand the Tao will often rule by fear. They threaten the people with death as the ultimate punishment for criminal acts. There is only one problem with this. What if people lose their fear of death? What will you do then? The ruling elite value their own lives and fear death, so they assume the same must be true for everyone. In a simplistic way, they imagine that if you capture and kill all criminals, then no one will dare to commit crimes. This fails to take the complexity of real life into account. And then in the second half, it goes into the metaphors where Lao Tzu expresses that there's the working of the Tao in the background that in the long run will balance everything out, much as we discuss with karmic mechanism. So here is the paraphrase that I want to offer for the second half. Reality regulates itself like a master executioner that kills those who should be killed. If we engage in killing ourselves, then we are basically trying to take the place of that executioner. It's like an inexperienced apprentice trying to use the tools of the great carpenter. You fumble around and cut your own hand instead of the wood. Thus, when we endorse killing in the name of justice, we actually hurt ourselves more as a society. So that's the paraphrase for chapter 74. Hopefully, it casts the chapter into modern language that is much more approachable, much more easy, readily grasped by the average person or people who have never heard of the Tao before. Now, let's go to our full circle discussion to end everything, to complete the circle, so to speak. In the last lines of Tao Te Ching, chapter 74, Lao Tzu talks about killing is an action that hurts oneself, like hurting your own hand while cutting wood. So I think just as a comment on that, it is not a big surprise to those of us who have learned the lesson about the interconnectedness of all beings, that we're all intricately connected to one another at a fundamental level. When that is the case, it does make sense that whatever good or bad that I do to others, I have also done to myself. Let's continue. We link this idea back to the first line to see how killing is not an effective deterrent without the fear of death. So the meaning from Lao Tzu is clear. Capital punishment can be ineffective and it is harmful to society itself. Lao Tzu himself would also not engage in absolutes, so he would not say something like never effective, always harmful. He would also be walking the balanced path. But the important thing is this: that same wisdom from Lao Tzu applies to us. If we try to hurt others, we end up hurting ourselves, and we fail to get what we want. So that is something to take to heart. This is not as easy to express in the language of this chapter, but I will nominate the last two lines. Those who substitute for the great carpenter to cut, it is rare that they do not hurt their own hands. In this conclusion of chapter 74, you can see that in the Tao, it is never absolute. Now, that's an absolutist statement about the Tao. Yeah, the Tao is never absolute, and it is rare, the expression, it is rare that they do not hurt their own hands. It doesn't rule out the possibility that sometimes people can cut for the great carpenter and not hurt their own hands. But more often than not, we damage ourselves, and therefore it is not the wise course of action for us as individuals, for our society as a whole. Let me go to the summary. What can we learn from today's talk, chapter 74 and also 75? Let's start with 74. This particular slide I showed last time, and now I think it makes more sense because we were able to conclude our discussion of 74. And It won't surprise you that in the second half, the most significant thing is the metaphors being used, the master executioner, and the great carpenter. So think about these as metaphors for natural processes, and these natural processes, of course, they would include life and death. And the teaching from Lao Tzu is that we should learn the wisdom of letting these processes take place without excessive interference from us. Once in a while, perhaps we're called upon to play a role in the process. The wisdom of the Tao will let you know when that is. But most of the time, it is enough for us just to observe the process taking place. Number 2 is the important consideration toward the very end of chapter 74 about cutting one's own hand, meaning doing damage to yourself. So this applies to us. It also applies to other people who have wronged us. Bottom line, negative people will end up with their own negativity. Our job is to not be one of the negative people. Other people who are negative that have inflicted their negativity upon others, including us, well, they're going to end up with their own negativity. It's a guarantee. Therefore, we should let go of any thoughts about getting back, getting even with someone. And as I mentioned, the best way to get even, just live your best life. That is the best revenge of all, and that doesn't hurt anyone. You're doing the best you can, following the Tao, living the best life in accordance with the Tao, and that is going to benefit everyone around you. So that is the wisdom from Lao Tzu. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us all travel safely so we can meet again. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.